humanity. Keep watching. The politics.
Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, and how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative discussion of financial literacy. With Professor Anthony Rivecchio, your financial problems will be solved at Parrot TV with Financial Focus University. Welcome to the Foreign Policy Review. I'm Dustin Pickering, your host, and today we have Carlo Parcelli and Billy Bob co-host with special guest Dr. Gerald Horne from the University of Houston. I'm going to allow him to introduce himself and today's topics of the January 6th hearings, as well as the Nord Stream pipeline and the explosions thereof. So let's have a brief introduction from Dr. Horne.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Gerald Horne, University of Houston, historian and book writer.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Horne. There's a lot going on in the world these days. There's tremendous changes taking place, both domestically, and internationally. There's huge polar shifts taking place. Really, I see it as a decline of Western imperialism and their struggle to maintain, their global hegemony and their unipolar status. So today we wanted to we want to touch on current events, but we want to talk about some domestic policy, how our domestic policy is shaping our country's, strategy and approach to dealing with the things that are taking place on the international stage with, an ascendant Russia, an ascendant China, and again, declining Western imperialism. It's all very interesting. Reality is very complex. I mean, it's you really have to pay attention to understand what's going on, and there's so many different narratives and explanations for what's going on and why. But I think you have a pretty good idea of what's going on and why, and we're glad to have your expertise. I'm not sure if Carlo wanted to open up with a direct question and start guiding our conversation into a particular. You always look confused, Carlo, when I throw it to you.
Well, I really just wanted to seduce viewers by asking Dr. Horne about the sabotage of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, and we can expand out from that and to get his take on it in general. We all know who did it, so. What do you think, Dr. Horne?
Well, I would say that there are three potential culprits, with a single country being implicated in all three scenarios. A, the United States. B, rogue elements in the United States national security establishment. Or C, the United States in collaboration with either NATO allies and or the Poles, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania at all. Now, with regard to the latter, I'm sure you probably heard of the tweet from Sikorsky, the prominent Polish official, congratulating the United States for the sabotage. Obviously, he knows something we don't know. But perhaps even more dangerous than those three scenarios that I sketched, including the scenario that suggests that there might be rogue elements within the national security establishment, not the first time that's happened, by the way, is this trying to pin the blame on Moscow. In other words, Moscow is sabotaging its pipeline, and the way that the scenario has been sketched feeds into this idea that there are these diabolical, devilish interests in Moscow who perhaps had prearranged to sabotage this, anticipating that a conflict with NATO would erupt, and then push the button in the Kremlin to complicate further the prospects for the economy of Germany in particular. And in the wider scheme of things, we're getting to a very perilous moment. It reminds me somehow of the weapons of mass destruction episode that led to the invasion of Iraq, where there's some sort of fabrication, except that the problem now is that this is not Iraq. You're dealing with a country which by some measures has the most ample arsenal of nuclear weapons on planet Earth. And to that end, it's also rather curious that Washington and Secretary of State Blinken in particular are charging Mr. Putin with issuing nuclear threats, although per the Washington Post, we know that Washington has been sending ever more apocalyptic warnings to Moscow for whatever reason. And in any case, if you look at the speech on the Kremlin website, which is in English if you don't read Russian, it's clear that Mr. Putin is responding to threats from the North Atlantic countries, not least the incoming British Prime Minister, Liz Truss. And we opened by discussing this Copernican transition that the planet is now undergoing. That is to say, 500 years of North Atlantic domination is coming to a screeching halt. Now, if you look at my book on the 16th century, which talks about the last time that the world went through such a transition, when this minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe, speaking of England, was able to leapfrog the pack and then pass the baton on to its revolting spawn, now headquartered in Washington, D.C. What I find remarkable is that that transition, it led to quite a bit of death and destruction. But as noted, with the nuclear genie out of the bottle, this transition that we may be undergoing now would make the one 500 years ago pale into insignificance. And let me just make two more points before I pass the mic. One is that I find it curious that on either side of the political barricades in the United States and in the North Atlantic community, there's hardly discussion of two major points that have brought us to the precipice of destruction. One is why, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did NATO continue? Why, if these capitalist countries are so concerned with domination, why wasn't Russia better integrated into the top table of the capitalist world instead of creeping ever closer to its border, which inevitably would drive it closer to China, which then brings me to point number two. Why isn't there more discussion of what happened 50 years ago with the Entente between Washington and Beijing on an anti-Soviet basis, which led to massive foreign direct investment in China, which has created this juggernaut? And as I say in my 16th century book, part of the problem there was that Ottoman Turkey, a superpower of that era, underestimated London and made an alliance with London against Catholic Spain. And it has eerie echoes to what we've been undergoing in the past half century. But with all of these intellectuals and think tanks and State Department bureaucrats and university professors, we're marching and sleepwalking to the brink of destruction with some of the most fundamental issues not even discussed.
Yeah, I'd like to bolster your remarks with a couple of statements. For instance, the Polish diplomat is married to Anne Applebaum, who's a longtime propagandist for the Washington Post, and it's been demonstrated through the Church Committee and the Pike Committee and the Rockefeller Commission way back in the 70s that the Washington Post is just simply an arm of the Central Intelligence Agency. And now that Jeff Bezos has contracts directly with the U.S. intelligence on the NSA, the CIA, you can go on, on and on. it's fairly obvious that she may have had some inside information about the sabotage. The second thing is I wanted to mention is the absurdity of Russia, and Alexander McCourse covered this very, very aptly, I thought. The absurdity of Russia sabotaging its own pipeline when all it had to do was shut it off rather than to blow it up. And it reminds me of another ridiculous set of instances that was just going on a couple of weeks ago, and that was the notion that the Russians were shelling Zaporozhye, the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye, which is totally absurd. You've got your security forces right there in the plant. Why would you be shelling that plant? So everything. If you can get past the absurdity of it, Vietnam, for example, if you want to go back to Vietnam or you want to talk about why these policymakers are not facing the real set of circumstances, it's because the reasons for these incursions, for example, in Vietnam, were disingenuous. Obviously, it was the military-industrial complex, but it had nothing to do with stopping communism. Let's get it had to do with enriching them and enhancing the technologies of the military-industrial complex. I can remember when this poor woman, April Oliver, did this little documentary and wrote several pieces on the use of sarin gas by the United States in Vietnam, and she was just pilloried. She's on the fringes still. She'll never be back in. Well, it took me about 10 minutes on the internet to find a manifest from a Navy vessel, a merchant vessel, U.S. Navy merchant vessel that had sarin gas on the manifest, and the destination was, guess what? South Vietnam. It took me like 10 or 15 minutes to find this thing. This sarin gas was on its way to Vietnam, and if it's on its way, it's going to be used. So there's a kind of fundamental dislocation from the truth that permeates all of these discussions.
Yeah. So Dr. Horne's options for who done it correctly all ended with the U.S. I mean,
yes.
Here is President Biden.
So here's President Biden reminding us in February that that the U.S.
if Russia invades, that means tanks and troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer the Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly? Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it. Schönen Dank.
And there you have it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just preposterous that they want to put out any other kind of explanation or saying that Russia was responsible. Like, God bless them. That's what they're going to do, and it's just a sad commentary on Western citizenry. If anybody believes that, it just means they're uninformed and out of touch. But so Gerald, you were touching on the greater political upheavals that are taking place. It kind of seems that the West has a strategy. That strategy is they were hoping they could first, take out Russia, weaken, destabilize, hopefully balkanize Russia, and then that would isolate China, and that would give them a better chance of doing the same thing to China. It seems kind of that domestically there was a faction within the ruling capitalist establishment that maybe had a different sort of strategy. And that strategy was to try and win Russia over onto the side of the West and then go after China with Russia on our side. That kind of seems like what Trump was trying to do. But he was, he was stopped from doing that. That strategy was blocked. That was not the consensus strategy of the capitalist class. And the establishment went after him. So to me, geostrategically thinking, like Trump's strategy seemed like it might be more effective, honestly. And I think they're both failed. They're both evil and corrupt and totally the wrong approach to global governance. But if you're thinking in strict, geopolitical terms, it would have made sense to try and get Russia as an ally, and then had that big, huge united front with the EU, Russia and the US against China. But maybe that was a pipe dream and wouldn't have ever materialized anyway. Could you give your thoughts on what was it that distinguished Trump and made him so hated by the ruling establishment? Because it really seems they went after him pretty hard with all the gloves off, and even the media, they kind of just disregarded even the pretense for objectivity when it came to Trump. It's like they just threw that out the window. And it was just all in to, get Trump out of there. We do not want him. I don't care, what the people want. Like, we're going to propagandize the people, and we're going to make sure he doesn't, doesn't maintain power, because he is a problem to our plans and to our objectives. Does any of that resonate with you, or?
Well, this is what I would say. I think that particularly amongst the liberal elites who are prominent in the universities and the think tanks in Hollywood, etc., that Trump ripped the mask off of the system and bared the fangs of the system, and then was able to mobilize 75 million people in 2020 towards that end. I don't find it accidental that with the ascension of Mr. Trump, even within the bowels of the elite, you began to have more searching critiques of the history of the United States, for example. Now, this, even though it's been attacked relentlessly by liberals and even some who consider themselves to be left and radical, part of that critique comes from the New York Times 1619 Project, which should have made obvious what was evident, which is that, yes, people like me are not in the United States accidentally. I mean, it's not accidental that a so-called abolitionist state, and of course, look at the recent comments by Governor DeSantis, who says that with 1776, that's when you began to have a critique of slavery. Well, how was it that in 1776 there were hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans? By 1860, there were millions. That's quite an abolitionist project, I must say. And so Mr. Trump tended to expose the ugliness, the ugly side of U.S. global and domestic policy. U.S. imperialism works more effectively, I'm afraid to say, if you have a figure like Barack Obama in the White House. But the problem there was that obviously the election of the 44th U.S. president triggered something very deep and profound, and perhaps even mad, within a significant percentage of the U.S. electorate, which led to this counter-reaction of Mr. Trump. And certainly, with regard to your point, to a certain degree, it is more rational, which is not a descriptor you usually apply to Mr. Trump, to suggest that there should have been an effort to co-opt Russia, then go after China, rather than take on Russia and China simultaneously. But I think that there are two problems. One is that it's not clear if Russia would have played ball, certainly not to the degree that China played ball in the 1970s and the 1980s.
Yeah.
Which then punctures that particular strategy. And then two is something else that's rarely discussed in the United States of America, that if you take these two major bourgeois parties and look at the base of each party, the Democrats have not won a majority of the Euro-American vote across class lines for decades now. And so they're heavily reliant upon the black vote. But then if you look at the retreat of Jim Crow, and myself and others have written about this voluminously, the retreat of Jim Crow was because of a Faustian bargain whereby Black Americans were induced to pipe down with regard to foreign policy in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, and then left-wing Black Americans like Paul Robeson are tossed overboard. You only have to beat one slave to keep the plantation in line, to return to that antebellum trope. And so because the base of the party, and let's not even talk about the labor movement, which is yet to recover from the Red Scare as well, and still acting like the Cold War is motoring along nicely. And so you have those two major constituencies that are generally either absent or complicit with regard to US imperial policy, which then empowers the hawks, the Anthony Blinkens, for example, to cite one example amongst many. And then I think that the Democrats feel that in terms of continuing to carry the flag of US imperial policy, that they do not necessarily have credibility because they don't win a majority of the Euro-American vote. They're relying upon those who are considered others. So they have to double down to basically try to assure and reassure that they can carry out these imperial tasks. Now, with regard to the two parties, and this is something to watch, that what unites them is that they're both all in with regard to winning over India. As a matter of fact, you can see what's happening in India right now, similar to what happened with regard to China. I mean, they're pouring in capital. For example, Apple is trying to reshore from China to India, for example. India is now the 5th largest economy. However, as you know, the policies of the BJP and the Modi regime in India is quite chauvinistic. And I recall that when Yugoslavia was breaking up in the 1990s, that all of a sudden you began to have conflicts in Midwestern cities between US nationals of Croat descent and Serbian descent, for example. Those contradictions were exported. Now you're beginning to see that the chauvinistic policies in New Delhi are being exported to UK with conflicts in the streets between Hindus and Muslims. You see it in Edison, New Jersey. You might have seen that piece in the New York Times the other day between the Indian Americans of Muslim descent and Hindu descent. And so this bargain with Delhi is going to bring even more of a downside than the bargain in previous decades with Beijing.
So I totally agree with that analysis, Dr. Horne. Godfrey Roberts, you're familiar with Godfrey Roberts. He's a China expert. He's written a book. He does a lot of great articles exposing Western narratives, Western anti-China narratives. He was kind enough to publish a little essay that I wrote in his newsletter, and it was just stating that. It was stating that that is the plan of the West. You know, it seemingly, you just described it, and I wanted to just restate it in my own words. Essentially, first we're going to take care of Russia, subvert it, weaken it, balkanize it if we can. Then we'll be able to turn our attention to China. The plan there is to decouple economically from China, and the hope is to turn India into the new China. All those businesses that are enjoying the cheap labor and the manufacturing in China can just move over to India. India will be on our side, and then we can destabilize and balkanize China. Mm-hmm. To me, that is the clear agenda that's afoot, and I think that's what you just kind of basically laid out. What do you guys think about that in the top row?
Well, obviously, Ukraine comes back into the picture because India is I think fairly solidly behind Russia in that regard, and and for obvious reasons, they're not stupid. They can read history. and much has been made about British colonial activity with the death of Elizabeth, and the British history with India, and the colonial history with India. And I don't think it's a difficult translation for the head the people in charge in India to make a comparison with U.S. hegemony. And I don't think it will be as effective, and I think the terms will be more stringent than maybe U.S. policymakers make them out to be. And certainly Modi, as Dr. Horne so rightly points out, is another stone cold nationalist when you come down to his politics, and frankly anti-Muslim. So
Yes.
I don't think that will be as effective as U.S. policymakers think.
So we have agreement that that's basically, I mean, it's seemingly the approach of Western imperialism. That's their strategy. And how effective is that strategy going to be going forward? How is Modi going to respond to that? He's hard to trust because he is a nationalist, and just like the guy in Turkey, they play both sides. They play both sides, and you can't have complete solidarity with them, unfortunately. But any thoughts on that, Dr. Horne?
Well, with regard to this new strategy, the problem is it's going to be significant collateral damage, to utilize a euphemism. I mean, for example, if you look at the locomotive of the European Union, speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany, its economy was heavily dependent upon cheap energy from Russia and exporting to China. But now, since Washington has turned its guns on both Moscow and Beijing, it seems as if Germany will be collateral damage. And certainly some of the stories coming out of Western Europe right now are rather apocalyptic in terms of people freezing in the dark within weeks or months. You might have seen that massive demonstration in Prague just the other day with folks complaining. Certainly some of these elections that are taking place, although they have, shall we say, euphemistically, a considerable downside, speaking of Italy, certainly it's a negative reaction to previous policies. And quite frankly, although I cannot confirm it with press clippings, it would not surprise me at all if a Forza Italia, which is part of the new Brothers coalition headed by Meloni, that Silvio Berlusconi, the 85-year-old former prime minister, is probably helping Moscow break sanctions as we speak. And with being part of the government incoming, that'll probably accelerate creating more strains within the European Union. But at the same time, I should be clear that I'm no fan of Prime Minister Meloni. I mean, if you look at her Twitter feed and look at what she has to say about people who look like me, I mean, it would make the Ku Klux Klan blush. But once again, this is a direct result of the catastrophic invasion and overthrow of the Libyan regime about a decade ago, which laid waste to the North African country, turned it into a transit route for Africans from all over the region to go across the Mediterranean to Italy, allowing demagogic politicians like the Brothers, the Five Star Movement, the Liga, etc., to capitalize upon it. And not to mention the fact that it's a predictable outcome of Cold War policy, because recall that the Communist Party of Italy once was one of the strongest in the world, that in the 1947 pivotal elections, the United States recruited Italian Americans to contact their relatives in Italy to make sure that the communist and socialist influence would diminish. You might recall the kidnapping and murder of Prime Minister Aldo Moro in the 1970s, with at least the acquiescence of Washington, which has been replicated and duplicated in movies too numerous to mention, because he was about to move to the historic compromise, to move to extend the olive branch to the Communist Party of Italy. So he had to go, and he did go. And it's not as if, to use the moth-eaten excuse of the past, that the Communist Party of Italy would then snuggle closer to Moscow, because of course they pioneered with the so-called Euro-communism, where they were trying to distance themselves from Moscow, as was their neighbor to the west, speaking of Yugoslavia, which had broken with Moscow under Tito as early as the late 1940s. That didn't save them either. Serbia was ultimately bombed into smithereens by the Clinton forces in the 1990s. And so if you destabilize the political ecosystem, if you weaken the main predators of the fascists, which are people to the left, inevitably the fascists will start to rise. It's no accident, like they're rising in Sweden with the last election, just like they're rising in the United States of America, per the January 6, 2021 attempted coup d'etat, which I'm afraid to say is hardly behind us. And I should make one more point about Italy, which is that Italy, during its heyday, during the Cold War, and with the influence of the Communist Party, it was producing these world-class intellectuals and filmmakers that were having influence on this side of the Atlantic, which was also rather disturbing. I'm speaking of Bernardo Bertolucci. You've probably seen his films, 1900,
Sure.
Last Emperor, Last Tango in Paris. Francesco Rossi. I would recommend his film Mani sulla Città, Hands Over the City, one of the most significant political films ever made, not to mention Pontecorvo and the Battle of Algiers and Burn, which of course were used for political education by the Black Panther Party back in the day. And so this influence from the left in Italy was floating across the Atlantic, worrying Washington. And so, of course, now you see fascists coming to power in Rome, and I guess they're happy.
Yeah,
we'll take a brief break. Just a brief break, and then we'll come right back and continue this discussion. You're watching the Foreign Policy Review. Please subscribe to our channel if you have not already. Thanks for watching today. We'll be right back.
In a world where the quality of information available to poorer communities is doctored, tainted, and sometimes regressive, where the words fake news have come to mean other people's opinions, it is vital to rely on news platforms with journalists who have feet on the ground and can report the truth. New York Parrot, a New York-based national and global news outlet, is changing the narratives of media operations. We focus on the news that matters, like self-empowerment, entrepreneurship, finances, health, security, politics, and more. We strive to curb violence, racial and economic discrimination, and to promote peace and socio-economic development of multiculturally diverse world. As we give voice to the people, we also give your business a voice and make it heard. Get your products and services off the ground by advertising on our fast-growing platform. With so much of daily visits to New York Parrot, you can't afford to be invisible to prospective clients on the website they trust the most. Our posts reach millions of people across the New York State and around the world. Advertising on our new site will unlock an audience of thousands of potential customers on your doorstep. New York Parrot is born to prosperously speak tomorrow for the voiceless.
Yes,
Foreign Policy Review. Let's Carlo, you had some thoughts?
Yes, many. Dr. Horne is so totally correct about the importance of the film arts in radical thinking here in the U.S. The Garden of the Finzi-Continis I would also include, and Pasolini, and we had Luciana Bon on, and she basically admitted that she was radicalized by film. And that's why she became such an important and essential Marxist film critic. Also, I wanted to add kind of losing my train of thought here, but I wanted to also add something about the Maloney, and that is Maloney is she's from a strain of Italian fascism that has had links to the Central Intelligence Agency since World War II. That's Gelly and the P2, and they've been involved in a number of the train station bombings and assassinations all over Italy. And essentially, it's kind of common knowledge that the Italian electorate has been. You want to talk about Russian meddling in U.S. elections? The Central Intelligence Agency, U.S. intelligence, has meddled in Italian elections since probably before World War II, but that has a tremendous track record of meddling after, and still does, and still meddled in this election. And it was in the U.S. intelligence community's interest to have Maloney elected, which seems to run counter to this notion that Berlusconi is going to cuddle up to Putin. I think that's Maloney's election is a way of hedging U.S. hedging bets against that. Ain't happening. That's not happening. That's just my opinion.
The only thing I didn't realize that she had openly racist stuff on her Twitter feed. So forgive me for being ignorant there. I did see an openly solidarity with Ukraine. So I was disappointed to see that she was expressing open solidarity with Ukraine, that kind of thing. Because I was hoping, like Dr. Horne had said, that she would, look out for the country's interests and maybe, not sign up to those anti-Russian sanctions. But it's unfortunate if she, I'm shocked, honestly, that she would have openly racist stuff that, to quote Dr. Horne, would make the KKK blush. I did not know that. That's awful.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
I just wanted to briefly add that this is so infuriating. This is infuriating about Libyans rushing to European shores, or Guatemalans trying to come to the U.S., or Hondurans, or whoever, because it's just so it's a result of U.S. foreign policy. I've been shouting about this for 50 years. It's U.S. foreign policy that drives people to the belly of the beast. It's the destruction of people's countries, like El Salvador in the 80s, which drove all the Salvadorians out, and because the U.S. was openly supporting death squads. They put a bullet into Bishop Romero while he was serving mass. My God, that was the U.S. doing. You're sure you're going to want to flee a country like that and one of the places you flee is the U.S. and for the U.S. media and these other clowns to make hay out of that, like, oh, everybody wants to come to the U.S. because it's this great. Oh, people have to be in the U.S. have to be disabused of these notions. They're idiots. I mean, one of my favorite things is to read the comments in the Breitbart and the Washington Post and all these other places that allow comments. I've been thrown off all of them, so all I can do is read them. But people are idiots in this country. They're just fucking idiots. I'm sorry, but anyway, that's my 2 cents.
What were some examples of some of these tweets? I haven't paid attention to hers. I pay attention to the but I'm just curious. I mean, I know she's an Islamophobe, basically. I know that's been said.
Well, one tweet, if I'm not mistaken, actually shows an African supposedly molesting this Italian woman, and that's used to. It's like from Birth of a Nation, the Hollywood film of 105 years ago or so.
It reminds me of the Lee Atwater propaganda with Willie Horton. Willie Horton, Karl Rove, Lee Atwater, that slime. That's the way they used to work here with domestic politics. And she's a racist. Yeah,
and it's anti-immigrant. But interestingly enough, it's particular immigrants. It's just like the United States, for example. The anti-immigrant sentiment does not necessarily extend to those coming from Ukraine, for example. As a matter of fact, the United States has flung the door wide open to those arriving from Eastern Europe. And see, this gets you to some of the contradictions of the U.S. left, which in some ways has clung ever closer to the myths of the origins of the United States than even liberals, centrists, and conservatives. Something I've been trying to puzzle out why. They've been some of the major critics of the work that I've done going back from the 16th century through the slavery period have come from the folks on the U.S. left who they like to portray the United States as heroic. Although the slave population is skyrocketing, going through the roof. Native Americans are being subjected to genocide, which of course they hardly confront. I mean, how many people in Berkeley and Oakland, where you supposedly have all these left-wing people, they probably never heard of the Ohlone, for example, Ohlone, who had been living there for 10,000 years before the European invasion. And so then they tried to justify or rationalize these right-wing coups. That is to say that, well, what we need to do is make a better appeal to the insurrectionists. And then, if the Democrats would just say they're for socialism, then people would not go for Trump. Well, I don't know. I think it's a little deeper than that. I mean, 1991, 55% of the Euro-American vote voted for David Duke, a Klansman and a Nazi, for governor. So you want me to believe that if his opposition had just said they were for the Green New Deal, the 55% would have swung. I think the 55% was based upon history, was based upon the culture that comes out of that history. And if we're not careful, we'll be debating all this in concentration camps.
So Dr. Horne, could you discuss January 6th in the context of racism?
Well, it's interesting. January 6th, in many ways, it was a U.S. classic. With roots stretching back to the 1580s and the origins of Anglo-settler colonialism in what they call North Carolina, which was basically a project across class lines of settlers being sponsored by the 0.001% in London, although, of course, those who are arriving in North America are from diverse class backgrounds. And so, likewise, if you look at January 6th, you have people flying in on private planes, you have CEOs, you have shopkeepers, you have, of course, a significant number of military veterans. You have a significant number of police officers from small towns in North Carolina. Interestingly enough, it's neck and neck as to who contributed the most insurrectionists on January 6th. Was it Texas, where I'm sitting now, the home of the counter-revolution of 1836, to use the title of one of my most recent books, where, of course, the genocide against Native Americans was something to behold, particularly the Comanches, the Caddo, who had an interlocking directorate with the Black population, or was it Florida, of Governor DeSantis fame, the chief executive who's going into Texas and putting migrants on planes and shipping them to Martha's Vineyard? Why is it? I mean, people need to ask fundamental questions. Why is it that Texas and Florida were neck and neck in terms of contributing insurrectionists when people could just take a subway from Virginia, for example, to get to the Capitol, or even walk from Maryland, for example, or drive over from West Virginia? So it's no accident that you did not see more faces like mine on January 6th, that it was a classic class collaborationist effort amongst European settlers, the kind of class collaboration that built this country in the first instance at the expense, the collateral damage of the indigenous population, the African population, etc. And as I suggested, we're not out of the woods yet, because pay close attention to these elections that will unfold within the next few weeks, because despite what I salute, which is the rebellion at the polls in Kansas against the Dobbs decision, the anti-choice decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in June 2022, it's not clear to me, at least, that the Republicans will be repelled at the polls, although, of course, I will be working to make sure that happens. But at a certain point, it seems to me the left have to be materialists and not idealists. That is to say, we have to look at reality as it stares us in the face and make analyses based upon that. Otherwise, we won't have any credibility. I mean, I will not have any credibility in the Black community if I'm telling people some of these fibs and tales that people on the left tell. And this is the constituency that votes against the right by 8-2 or 9-1. I mean, somebody explain that to me.
I live in Hyattsville, Maryland, which is 2 miles from the mile and a half from the DC line, the Northeast DC line. And what you say about that is true. The county I live in is Prince George's County, and it's the richest predominantly African American county in the country, bar none. Now, that's 7 of the 11 richest counties. This is very telling. Of the richest counties in the U.S. are around Washington, D.C., primarily because of the military-industrial complex and all the money that's in play. Big pharma, the lot of the criminals. But we call the big towers around the Beltway bandits, and you're absolutely right. The people in my neighborhood are greatly afraid of what of the MAGA people, of the Trump people. They see a fundamentally racist element driving them. I don't care what these so-called leftist commentators say about it being the economy, and these blue-collar people around the country are afraid of the economy. Frankly, enough polls have been done, enough research has been done to demonstrate that the Republicans that vote MAGA are predominantly upper middle class, and they got enough fucking money. Excuse my French, but they got enough money to fly around the country and go to all these MAGA demonstrations and all that stuff, and they're getting money from very powerful people, the Skate Foundation, Koch brothers foundations, and all that stuff. So that's out the picture. It has nothing to do with economics. It has everything to do. It has. One of the examples is you'll hear the same thing come out of a leftist mouth, that it's healthcare, social healthcare, and their implications. We got to socialize healthcare. Well, the last thing that the MAGA people want to do is have anything to do with socialism and healthcare. Just like trade unions, they don't want to have anything to do with trade unions. So that whole economic argument is just horseshit. As far as I'm concerned, it's pure racism. And that gave me, that January 6th situation gave me great trepidation. For what happened to minorities in this country. Blacks, and Jews, and I know. Anyway, go ahead.
So that gets us back to so personally, I kind of agree with the Marxian perspective that there's the fundamental reality is the economic relationships, and relationships to the means of production, and this kind of has this is the fundamental issue from which our analysis ought to be based upon. And I think to view racism within the paradigm and through the lens of oppositional class interests, I think is the most, the most accurate way to understand what it is, understand why it exists, understand why it is perpetuated. And if you try and, the liberals try to look at racism without using the paradigm, without using the lens of class struggle and oppositional class interests. And, they give lip service against racism, but they don't ever address the underlying fundamental reality that is contributing to and causing racism. So I'm curious, Dr. Horne, about your thoughts on racism and its proper context within the lens of oppositional class interests, and within a capitalist society where owners and workers, fight and struggle for access to the levers of power. And how it is, the capitalist class is interested in perpetuating racism, dividing the working class along racist lines, along religious lines, etc. And certainly they do that to this very day. and they appeal to this, this bigotry that does exist. It's been inculcated through generations and generations in this country, and they appeal to it in order to, divide society and maintain their political hegemony domestically and their empire, around the world. There's a debate there, right? Like some people identify racism as the fundamental divider, and they disagree that class is the fundamental divider. What are your thoughts on any of that or all of that?
Well, first of all, part of the problem in the United States is that what's referred to as race is really a disguised class question. Let's move away from using the term slave to using the term unpaid worker. So at one point, you had in a working class, you had unpaid workers and you had paid workers. Now, both were being exploited. The issue for those at the top of the pyramid was, how do you convince these Euro-American paid workers that they should not ally with the unpaid workers? And oftentimes it happened. But see, what you have to realize is that under this settler colonial project, there is a kind of American dream that unfolds for too many. I was just reviewing a book. It'll appear in the academic journal, Diplomatic History. And it was lauding the fact, because it took a comment from Marx's Engels' Communist Manifesto about the productive forces of capitalism. And then it was saying, well, look at these land-grant universities in the United States. They're just a marvel. But these land-grant universities, Ohio State, University of Wisconsin, Madison, et cetera, it's based on land taken from the Native Americans. Negroes were barred until we almost were about to have to burn the place down. And so if you look at, as I do in my Texas book, on the Cherokees, who tried to assimilate up to and including enslaving Africans, up to and including converting to Christianity and sedentary agriculture, dressing sartorially like the settlers, living in mansions, they still had to go. And in fact, in terms of the so-called American dream, you had Europeans fresh off the boat moving into their mansions. I mean, I call it a roughhouse Airbnb process. And so that is what we've been up against. And this brings me to Governor DeSantis of Florida, who we're told will be the Republican nominee for president if not Mr. Trump himself. Well, if you look at his coalition, not to mention look at himself, I mean, he's only worth about $300,000, which may sound like a lot to some of you, but in terms of the elite, that's chicken feed. And if you look at that escapade at Martha's Vineyard, the political message there, in terms of sending migrants to Martha's Vineyard, was that you elites in Martha's Vineyard, you're not staying true to the original bargain of settler colonialism, whereby we, the dispossessed European settlers, were favored over all others. And so we're going to put these people right in your face, right in your front yard, to make you confront that reality. And so we're talking about 75 million people. But the problem is, as I said, that many of those who consider themselves radical and Marxist, they're the ones who are revolting against a new sort of class analysis. I mean, for example, they're always talking about identity politics. That's the phrase they affixed to many Black Americans. Or to put it another way, that's the phrase they affixed to solidarity amongst the descendants of the unpaid working class. Now, militarized identity politics, whereby Cherokees were marched at gunpoint across the continent and had to give up their property, that was turned over to this new identity historically, which Du Bois pointed out. This term whiteness is not like Homo sapien. This is a relatively recent identity that rises consistent with the rise of capitalism. That's not identity politics. It's the identity. So in other words, they wind up attacking the people who are most prone to vote against the right, and then making excuses for the right without even realizing what they're doing.
Wow. So we have about 5 minutes into the program left. Does anybody have any comments on that?
No, but I'd like. Oh, go ahead, Billy Bob. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna just start a little diatribe about how the U.S. has squandered its hegemony since the end of World War II. How they've really at the end of World War II they accounted for over half the globe's economy and only like 5% of the population, and they've spent that big disparity of wealth into creating a military empire that has military installations in more than 3/4 of the planet's countries, and just perpetual war. We've averaged a regime change every year since then. We've had death squads, in Central and South America. We've had our fundamental terrorists in the Middle East doing the same, sponsoring these things in Indonesia. Just done terrible things, destroying entire societies for the benefit of Western corporations. And we've really made a mess. And so, when these immigrants, from Central and South America come up here, or when the immigrants from Africa try and go into Europe, like that is a result of imperialism. That's a result of our behavior over the last 75 years. And the response to that is an anti-immigrant, a racist, messaging that's perpetuated on, by the conservatives, by the right, and it's awful. Like it's they're not being accountable for the causes of what's going on. So I think China definitely offers a much better alternative to global governance, and I think as the Western imperialism is in decline, as China ascends, as Russia ascends. Notwithstanding the empire's response to that, but they definitely are going to have a better approach to global governance, and it'll be better for humanity. You're not going to have the regime changes. Socialism is going to be allowed to develop without being mercilessly attacked, like it has been, by the Western Empire. So I think moves towards that are I'm optimistic about the future. Domestically, it remains to be seen on how the West is going to respond to their own decline. Are things going to get worse? Is immigration? That's definitely a possibility, but there's also a possibility for improvement, and for as Western imperialism declines, countries around the world, the developing world will have a chance to develop, and not they'll have good societies that aren't going to be destroyed by us, and they're not going to have a reason to try and come to our racist country.
Well, that's obvious in the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Especially in Africa, for example, because with AFRICOM, all you have is a security arrangement. I don't know how many times I have to repeat.
Yeah, it's nothing. It's not. They're not developing Africa.
You have a totally different thing. You don't have the IMF. You don't have the World Bank picking everybody's pocket anymore. You have an alternative, and all the CIA and the State Department can think to do is run coups up and down the Sahel and foment civil war in Ethiopia.
Yeah, they put in their puppet proxies,
all that stuff.
Steal the
game's
resources.
Over, right, Dr. Horne? Like that game is over.
Well, what's interesting is that there have been about 19 tabletop exercises in recent years where the United States confronts the People's Liberation Army of China, and the United States has lost every one. But I don't think that will necessarily deter or detain these hotheads in Washington, because what's at stake from their point of view is global hegemony. And they have naturalized and normalized this process whereby those from the so-called Anglosphere have been at the top of the pyramid. They've naturalized it. That seems like the natural order of things. It seems like like this construction of quote whiteness, etc., where it's naturalized and normalized that those folks will be at the top of the pyramid, and that's about to shift. And it's not going to be an easy shift. It'll be a bumpy transition, to put it mildly. And if we escape without planet Earth being blown to smithereens, we should consider ourselves to be lucky, because, as we know, when cornered, they will fight back viciously, and it's up to us to stay their hand.
It was a wonderful discussion today with Dr. Horne. Thanks for joining us. And it's been the Foreign Policy Review. Watch some of our other programming. I love the final note we did there. Excellent discussion. And go back and watch it from the beginning and subscribe to our channel while you're watching. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Horne, Billy Carlo. Thanks for enjoying this discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horne. Yes,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stick around after the show, and we'll thank you some more, Dr. Horne.
Oh, I see.
I am looking for the. There it is. Okay, thank you so much.